Reginald Kray, prisoner number 058111, extract from prison file. Type of report redacted. His general behavior is good, and he appears to be able to cope with prison life in general. He continues to play a supporting role to his brother, and although it is not easy to gauge his innermost thoughts, there are hints that he is growing tired of the support he needs to give his twin brother. Just as his brother's demeanor may have improved, Reginald has deteriorated. And at times he looks depressed and fed up with his brother's activities. As with his brother, there are members of the family that visit at regular intervals, and he seems to get much support from the visits he receives. He seems content to plod along in the present setting and attracts the company of many inmates because of his notoriety. His brother prefers this aspect of Parkhurst life, whereas Reginald Kray would prefer to shake off this reputation and settle down to serve his sentence quietly. Author redacted. July 20, 1976. Ronald Kray, prisoner number 058110, extract from report on prison conduct. I think it is true to say that Ronald Kray remains very dependent on his twin and indeed on staff, especially medical, for his emotional survival. He tends to get into more usually minor trouble than his brother. Both Krays have progressed better than one would have anticipated. It is clear that they still have some influence over their peers and still have certain contacts outside. Within the prison setting, of course, there are many that would bask in their reflected glory and assist in perpetrating the Kray legend. On the whole, both are outwardly cooperative, even pleasant and courteous to most staff. They have both worked in C-Wing toy shop and on cleaners, Reginald more industriously, but neither being very keen to maximize their efforts. Neither has shown any feeling about their offenses, and obviously both remain criminally cultured and are unlikely to change in this respect. It is difficult to estimate the regard still held for them outside, but I suspect it would be greater than I think. Author redacted. July 21, 1976. From their East End beginnings, the Kray twins would go on to run one of the most powerful and feared criminal organizations in London. Their influence wouldn't only be felt by the nightclubs and casinos of the capital, but also some of the highest tiers of government. They were untouchable, and the Krays remain a much remembered part of 60s culture, like the celebrity icons that filled their establishments. This is the story of Reggie and Ronnie Kray. The Kray family had little in the way of money, and the impending arrival of two new children no doubt placed a strain on the family, but their mother, Violet Ann Lee Kray, was over the moon with the birth of her twin sons. Life in the East End of London was not without its problems. Living conditions were cramped and money was scarce. Violet had been raised in a strict household, and when she eloped to marry the boy's father, Charles, she was disowned by her family. After a difficult upbringing, Violet wanted to raise her children in a loving environment. The twins had an older brother who was called Charlie. He was born in July 1927. Violet doted on her children being a dominant figure in their lives. Reggie and Ronnie's parents went through an extraordinarily difficult period towards the end of the 1920s when they had a daughter, but she died when she was only a baby. During the evening of October 24, 1933, Reginald was the first of the Kray twins to be born. His brother Ron followed 10 minutes later. It wasn't until the arrival of the twins that Violet reconnected with her family, and the boy's grandfather took a real shine to his new grandsons. The twins were showered with love and affection, especially from their Auntie Rose. However, the boy's father, Charles David Kray, was absent from the family home throughout their younger years. It fairly contributed to their upbringing, as he was often on the run from the police. He made his living buying and selling jewelry and clothing, and by all accounts earning good money, setting the family slightly apart from the poverty that surrounded them. The children were raised in Hoxton. It was one of Britain's most impoverished areas with few employment opportunities and basic living conditions. As they grew from babies into young boys, it was quite clear the identical twins had distinct differences. Ronnie would often scream and shout to get attention, but his brother found communication easier. He was far more outgoing. The twins competed for their mother's attention, with each of them trying to outdo the other with grand displays of affection, but they were always equal in their mother's eyes. Reggie was considered the more intelligent of the two and could often draw his brother into episodes of misbehavior. They both enjoyed causing trouble. Though the twins kept a watchful eye on one another, they were each other's worst enemy, their fiercest protector. As the brain count of World War II loomed in 1938, Violet wanted to be closer to her family, so the Kray family packed their things and moved less than a mile away to Valence Road in Bethnal Green. When the twins were 6, their father Charles had been called up for military service but was unwilling to leave to go to war. Preferring to stay home to run his various business ventures, he disappeared. The situation wasn't all that uncommon, as the area where they lived was known locally as Deserters' Corner due to the number of men who chose not to answer their draft papers. Now and again the twins' father would return and was almost captured on 2 occasions before he found a suitable hiding place under a table or in a cupboard. The twins often saw their father's attempts to outwit the law. When Reggie was 8 years old, he saw the extreme lengths people would go to protect their livelihood. Reggie had a friend who helped pack loads of bread for a delivery driver. One day when the driver was away from the vehicle, the 2 boys started messing about pretending to drive the van. Reggie watched on as his young friend put the keys in the ignition and the vehicle rolled backwards, hitting an air raid shelter behind them. The boys were unaware that another young boy was standing behind the van. He was killed instantly. When the driver returned to the horrific scene, he told Reggie and his friend to keep their mouths shut as he might lose his job. The boy's death was recorded as an accident, and Reggie would later learn that the boy who was killed had a twin sister. As it was ruled an accident, the boy's family never got any compensation. Of all the terrible things that Reggie Kray recalls doing in his life, he stated that it was one of the saddest things of all. The Kray family briefly moved to a farm in Suffolk to get away from the devastation of the Blitz, but Violet missed the East End so much that the family decided to move back. Playing in the dust and rubble of the bomb sites with Ronnie's Alsatian dog Frida, the boys made a name for themselves as they were not afraid to get into a fight with other children. After they left Daniel Street School at 15, they briefly went on to work at Billingsgate Fish Market. Ronnie collected the discarded fish boxes, and Reggie worked as a trainee salesman. Reggie enjoyed the company of others, but Ronnie was more socially awkward, preferring to keep himself to himself. In their spare time, they had taken up boxing, inspired by Ronnie and Reggie's maternal grandfather, James Lee, known as the Southpaw Cannonball because of the sheer power of his left-handed punch. He would be frequently seen practicing punching a mattress in the garden, or bare-knuckle boxing in Victoria Park. After joining the Navy during the war, their older brother Charlie was also making a name for himself on the Navy boxing circuit. He would often return to teach his younger brothers the ropes, further encouraging their love of the sport. The twins hung a canvas bag from the ceiling of one of their bedrooms and began practicing. They'd already been in a boxing ring. A fight was set up at a fun fair where the boys fought with each other. It lasted 3 rounds, and they earned half a crown. A local coach who was in attendance spotted them, and believed they had potential to go professional, so decided to train them. The twins gave up cigarettes and alcohol, and undertook a rigorous training regime at Repton Boxing Club, a business that still stands to this day. The hard work was paying off as Reggie won the London Schoolboys Boxing Championship and won 7 of his professional fights. With what Ronnie lacked in technique, he made up for in sheer brute force. The twins didn't know how to keep the fighting in the ring. They'd been in trouble with the law in the past, but in the early 1950s, after being spotted attacking another 16-year-old in Hackney, they were arrested. They were remanded in custody and faced a trial at the Old Bailey. With the prospect of a prison sentence hanging over their heads, the twins used intimidation to silence both the witness and the victim. The case was eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. The twins learned that by creating fear they could get what they wanted. But it wasn't long until the law caught up with them. During the summer of that year, both Ronnie and Reggie assaulted the same policeman on the same afternoon, only a few hours apart. While standing outside a cafe on Bethnal Green, Ronnie was pushed in the back by a policeman telling him and his friends to move along. Unhappy at being shoved, Ronnie turned around and punched the officer square in the jaw, knocking the man off his feet before running away. It wouldn't be long until Ronnie was caught and taken into police custody, but he felt that he had somehow let his brother down, so went searching for the officer. After a few hours of searching the same street where the officer had initially been struck, he spotted the policeman and tapped him on the shoulder. As the officer turned around, Reggie punched him in the face. The Kray twins appeared before magistrates to plead their case, along with the help of the local priest who begged for forgiveness. The teenagers were only given probation. On March 2, 1952, Ronald and Reginald were called up for national service. They hated routine and anyone in a uniform. They wanted to be physical training instructors with the Royal Fusiliers, and this would provide the exercise regime needed to improve their boxing careers. On the first day, and only a few hours in, they both asked for a position as a physical training instructor. Their supervisor denied the request. Unimpressed with the corporal's response, they decided they had enough and walked towards the door. They were asked where they were going, and the corporal grabbed Ronnie's arm. He didn't like anyone putting their hands on him, so Ronnie punched his superior in the mouth. The twins left and went to their mother's house. The army arrived on their doorstep shortly after to collect them. Although Ronnie was responsible for the assault, they blamed each other, hoping that the corporal wouldn't be able to tell the two apart and they both might walk free. This was a trick they had successfully applied when they were younger. However, rather than the assault charges being dropped because no one could prove who did it exactly, it was agreed to put both of them in the guard room in the Tower of London. While there, the twins met a young man called Dickie Morgan, and they all decided to make a run for it when their sentence was up. As soon as they were let out the door, the three fled to Dickie Morgan's home close to the Docklands in London. The twins decided to abandon boxing altogether in favor of a life of crime, as many boxing promoters wouldn't book them due to their criminal record. They were still being pursued by the army, who eventually caught up with them. The twins would go on to serve time in prison for assault. Guards were subjected to taunts and tantrums, and Reggie and Ronnie dumped the contents of bins and latrine buckets over the heads of prison officials while their backs were turned. While incarcerated, the twins formed friendships with fellow criminals. When they were released, they were dishonorably discharged from the army. They eventually found work as security guards in an old converted cinema that was operating as a billiard hall called the Regal in Mile End. When the manager resigned, Ronnie and Reggie saw their chance. Paying only £5 a week in rent, the twins redecorated the hall and added over a dozen new snooker tables. At the time, if you ran a business in the East End, you'd often find that you would be required to pay some form of protection money to a local gang. They'd explain that they were offering a service to protect your business from the other rival gangs in the area. In truth, the business was mostly only endangered from the gang offering the service. If the owner refused, they would undoubtedly find their property burgled or damaged as a warning. They would have to pay up if they didn't want it to happen again. A Maltese gang entered the Regal expecting to get what they believed they were owed for providing protection to the club, but with the twins, they got more than they bargained for. As rather than giving up some of their takings, Ronnie took a sword and stabbed the gang leader through his hand, pinning him to a snooker table. This event inspired them to start their own protection racket, as they had easily fended off the other gangs in the area. Bookies, cafes, gambling halls and pubs were all subjected to their protection fee. Not only did they have the income from the Regal, they now had a large inflow of cash from all the protection rackets they were running. However, if they wanted to break out of the confines of the East End and make it big in the criminal underworld, they would need to get a foothold in the West End of London. During 1955, after a fight between two crime bosses, one of them needed protection and the Kray twins were able to offer their services. Jack Comer, otherwise known as Jack Spot, ran a large amount of the criminal activity in London with another man called Billy Hill. The pair called themselves the Kings of the Underworld, but after the two fell out and Jack Spot was severely injured after having his face slashed, he needed some additional muscle as he couldn't trust some of his own gang members. This is where the Krays flourished and learnt a lot from Jack Spot from their time working together. Eventually, Jack Spot became tired of the trouble the twins caused him and retired from a life of crime, leaving an opening waiting to be filled by the next gang looking to run criminal activity across both the East and West End of London. Around this period was the first time Ronnie Kray shot someone. A car dealer that the Krays were meant to be protecting had a visit from a disgruntled Docklands worker who had purchased a faulty car. Demanding his money back, the incensed buyer was refused and promptly told the car dealer that he would return the next day with his friends to retrieve the funds he was owed. As soon as he left, Ronnie was informed about the visit. When the dock worker returned on his own the next day, Ronnie was waiting for him and shot the man in the leg. When Reggie found out, he did his best to get his brother out of trouble by pretending to be Ronnie. After police turned up a Valence Road asking Reggie to attend an identification parade, Reggie went along willingly. He was identified by the victim as the shooter, but Reggie had a cast-iron alibi for the time he was meant to have shot the man. No one was prosecuted, but Reggie had a few choice words with his brother explaining the risks he was taking by going around shooting people. In Ronnie's eyes, the risk he took paid off, as few criminals in London were prepared to use a firearm at that time, and as word travels fast in the capital, it was confirmed to all those who operated in the criminal underworld that the twins were not to be messed with. During the summer of 1956, the twins were asked to help stamp out some trouble in the Stranglers nightclub in the West End. The owner was desperate to stop persistent fighting that seemed to plague the club. With the problem dealt with, the following few years were extremely prosperous for Reggie Kray and the gang he employed. They referred to themselves as the Firm. It included Reggie and Ronnie Kray, their cousin Ronnie Hart, Ian Barry, Albert Donahue, Jack Dixon and brothers Tony and Chris Lambriano. This gang of thieves, murderers and hangers-on were desperate to make a name for themselves, and while Reggie was climbing the criminal ladder, the same couldn't be said for Ronnie. He was arrested for assault in November 1956. The twins had a dispute with another gang in the area when Ronnie and his followers turned up at a pub where the rival gang often met, and a violent outbreak ensued where a man was almost stabbed to death. Ronnie was sentenced to 3 years for grievous bodily harm along with firearms possession and was sent to Wandsworth, a Category B prison. On the outside, Reggie's business ventures, both legitimate and not so legitimate, went from strength to strength as now he was outside his brother's influence. He started protecting upper-class illegal gambling parties in Mayfair in Belgravia, and opened the Double R Club on Bow Road. Ronnie would often hand out swift and violent retribution if the twins had been slighted, but as he was temporarily out of the picture, business was on the up. Ronnie was well behaved in prison, and welcomed visits from his friends and family, but he got transferred to Camp Hill Prison on the Isle of Wight. This was a Category C prison and meant fewer restrictions were placed on his movements. Ronnie's mental state began to deteriorate quickly. At the end of 1957, Ronnie received news that his Auntie Rose had passed away from leukemia, and he didn't take the news well and he had to be put into a straitjacket. He was eventually certified, and transferred to Long Grove Mental Hospital in Surrey. Once there, Ronnie was sure that one of the patients was a dog, and he would often converse with the radiator, but now with the proper treatment, Ronnie's mental health slowly began to improve. Unfortunately, security at the hospital was lax and Ronnie would be allowed visitors every Sunday, which often included his brother Reggie. Well aware that his brother was now registered as insane and Ronnie would only be released when the authorities deemed him competent, Reggie felt it was his responsibility to get his brother out. It wouldn't take heavy-duty equipment to tunnel under the hospital walls, but a simple scheme that would only involve Ronnie walking straight out the front door. Reggie visited Ronnie one Sunday as he often would do, and while the guard was distracted, the pair switched clothes in the bathroom and Ronnie casually made his way to the exit, and no one suspected a thing until Reggie went to leave. As Reggie had his identification, there was little hospital staff could do. While Ronnie was holed up in a caravan in Suffolk, Reggie knew that if his brother was away long enough, he would have to be reassessed upon his return. Ronnie eventually handed himself in and was later diagnosed fit to finish his prison sentence at Wandsworth. A psychiatrist was likely paid off by Reggie. Ronnie was released from prison in the spring of 1958. Reggie now had to manage not only the twins' business interests, but also Ronnie's bloodlust and ever more erratic demands. Ronnie's incarceration had changed him, and not for the better. In February 1960, Reggie would also have to serve time after he, Ronnie and an associate Daniel Shea went to collect some protection money from a shop on Finchley Road called Swiss Travel Goods. The visit didn't go entirely to plan, as the owner had informed the police, who were hiding in the back room, and overheard the demand for £100. After the exchange, both Daniel Shea and Reggie Kray were arrested. Reggie was sentenced to 18 months, and Daniel Shea was sentenced to 3 years. Although Ronnie was present, he was never prosecuted. In spite of the violence that often fired them, the twins would undertake one of their most profitable business ventures, the purchase of Esmeralda's Barn, located in Knightsbridge. The casino was extremely lucrative and owned by Stefan de Fay. Reggie was out on bail pending a review of his case, so after a visit from the twins and their financial advisor, the owner agreed to sell the business in the autumn of 1960, with the threat of violence looming from the two brothers who had made a name for themselves for intimidation. It wasn't a decision Stefan de Fay pondered for long. The place could practically run itself. It had a good bar, was well respected, and the staff were well trained. With Esmeralda's Barn under their management, and due to the legalization of gambling in 1961, the twins and their associates were set for a very fruitful period in their lives. They brought Lord Effingham onto the board of directors, who would often greet each guest as they came in. Reggie and Ronnie believed having an earl from a distinguished lineage would legitimize the casino with the upper classes. In between, opening or buying into two more nightclubs, the Kentucky and the Cambridge Room, the twins' nightclubs were being attended by the rich and famous upper class who had little knowledge of their less than legitimate methods. The premiere for the film, Sparrows Can't Sing, was held on Mile End Road during February 1963, and the after-show party was held at both the Kentucky and Esmeralda's barn, with some scenes for the film being shot at the Kentucky. Things couldn't be better for Reggie and Ronnie, now with the legal means to make money, but the twins couldn't leave their violent past behind. They were still committing armed robbery, arson, fraud and running protection rackets. The twins' business manager was Leslie Payne, nicknamed Payne the Brain. He worked as a frontman and financial fixer for Reggie and Ronnie. He lived in Dulwich along with his wife and two children, and was an unlikely fit for the firm given his respectable appearance. The twins were not only making £1,600 a week from the gaming tables, but they were also demanding protection money from the other casinos and clubs in the area, which saw them making anywhere up to £150 from each establishment. Frequently photographed with celebrities who flocked in droves to their clubs and casinos, Reggie and Ronnie became celebrities in their own right, and were often splashed across the front pages of the UK tabloids. The twins also made large donations to a number of hospitals and youth clubs throughout the East End, well aware of the publicity their generosity would bring them. Though they couldn't entirely escape their criminal background, brushing shoulders with celebrities and making donations to places in need often softened the public perception of them. They had exceeded even their wildest expectations. However, they were still haunted by their East End beginnings, and couldn't fully capitalize on most of their business ventures. While threats of violence and often the act itself had gotten them where they were, it didn't help them stay there. Ronnie began to lend money to gamblers who couldn't pay back their debts. In one terrifying incident, one gambler had amassed a debt of £1,000. Ronnie took umbrage to the liberties he believed the man was taking, so he dragged him behind an alley and took a sword to his mouth. He then pushed the blade further, which sliced open the sides of the man's face. The victim needed cosmetic surgery but never revealed the crime to police. Further punishments involved the use of a red-hot branding iron, and the Krays, more so Ronnie, didn't draw the line at attacking their friends. After telling Ronnie that he might have put on some weight, a friend was also slashed in the face, and Ronnie also shot two acquaintances in the feet. These outbursts of violence from Ronnie also marked a period of financial decline for the twins. When Reggie briefly returned to prison after losing an appeal against extorting money from Swiss travel goods, Esmeralda's barn started to run into trouble. The Double R's license was also revoked. Both were lucrative establishments, but with their businesses now failing, it wasn't long before the Inland Revenue sent them a tax demand which they couldn't pay, so Esmeralda's barn had to close its doors. Despite their setbacks with the clubs and casinos of London's West End, they seemed to have no shortage of cash and were often keen to widen the scope of their business ventures. So Ronnie, and later Reggie, started to invest in the development of the new town in Enugu, Nigeria. Initially investing £25,000, this was later followed up with further financial contributions. However, they saw no returns apart from a few trips abroad for Ronnie, who believed that he was creating a new utopia. Either way, the twins had plenty of other illegitimate ways to make money. One of these was something called long-firm fraud, or what is now known as consumer credit fraud. The firm would set up a distribution company that operated legitimately for a short period. They would make a good impression, paying their bills on time and doing everything by the book to make suppliers think that their business had a good line of credit. This would allow the firm to build relationships with a large number of suppliers, before ordering a considerable amount of goods on credit. The business would then hold a clearance sale before vanishing. Once the ruse had been discovered, the culprits would have long since disappeared, leaving unsettled debts, furious creditors and the authorities with no clue as to their whereabouts. It was reported that in 1964, the Krays made around £100,000 from these scams alone. At their peak, it was said the Krays were making somewhere in the region of £200,000, which was no small sum, as this was prior to the 1970s. No one can put an exact figure on the amount of cash moving through the books. However, their operation most certainly had its expenses, along with the vast amounts of money they would pay on clothes, cars and trips overseas. With payments to family members of the firm who had been locked up, payments to associates and the bill from the Inland Revenue, perhaps the twins weren't as well off as some might suspect. In 1965, the Kray twins began to expand their business across the Atlantic Ocean, and they started working with the American Mafia. $55,000 in bonds were stolen from a bank in Canada, and as the funds couldn't be laundered in North America, they were brought to Europe. The twins sold the bonds, cementing their relationship with the Mafia, and things looked to be moving in the right direction for Reggie and Ronnie. From a young age, Ronnie had an obsession with the American gangsters in the 1920s, looking to emulate the mob bosses he saw on screen. He would be sharply dressed in tailor-made suits, and employed his own private barber. He was even nicknamed the Colonel by members of the firm, which further stoked the fires of his ego and played into the image he had of himself. Although their trip to America wasn't a huge financial success, it was for Ronnie. Rubbing shoulders with the perceived heroes of his youth gave him a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. It wouldn't be long until there was a fly in the ointment, as the Krays were continuing to demand money from the other clubs and casinos in the West End of London. One haunt was called the Hideaway, and the owner reported the Krays to the police. Mad Teddy Smith, an associate of the twins, caused a significant amount of damage, and Reggie and Ronnie had demanded half of the club's profits, so were both arrested and taken into custody. Charged with demanding money with menace, the twins were incarcerated for 56 days before a trial began at the Old Bailey during February 1965. After a retrial, because the first jury couldn't reach a decision, the second trial was halted after it emerged that the owner of the Hideaway, Hugh McGowan, had in fact been a police informant, and the defense had dug up enough dirt on him to have the case thrown out. Before the ink was even dry on the court paperwork, the twins purchased the Hideaway and changed the name to the El Morocco. After throwing a party at the venue, the Krays and their solicitor were interviewed about the trial and what they would be doing next.
How much has this trial cost you?
It's cost us roughly £8,000.
And how do you feel about that?
I don't suppose anyone likes the idea of spending that money for no reason at all, you know.
Does it leave you broke, or how does it leave you?
It doesn't leave us broke, but at the same time it's a lot of money to have to pay out when money's innocent, you know.
A lot of people have got the impression from this trial that Clubland, London, is very tough. Do you think it is? You run a couple of clubs.
Well, in all clubs you get an occasional drunk, you know, and sometimes have to be slung out, and that's why there's doormen and that, but I suppose it's like Clubland all over the world, really. It's just the same as... I don't suppose it can be that bad, as people won't go to them, really, would they?
Ronald, what do you think about Clubland in London?
Well, I think most clubs are very respectable, you know, and I don't think there's any trouble at all in them, except occasionally.
Can you tell me why, during the trial, you didn't give evidence?
Well, we was advised by legal people not to give evidence.
Why was that?
Well, the law of this country is well established. The onus is on the prosecution to prove its case. Counsel for these two men and the third defendant were quite satisfied in their own mind, as I in my own humble way was as well, that the prosecution had not proved their case, and there was no obligation on these men to go and to make any answer to any of the allegations against them.
What are you going to do now that it's all over?
I like to have a bit of family life now, you know. I intend to get married in the near future. I did before this case, but it's put back over the case, and just get married as soon as possible, you know.
Ronald, what are you going to do now?
Well, I'd like to go abroad for a short while, and then I'd like to be left alone.
On April 19, 1965, Reggie Kray was married to Frances Shea at St. James's Church, in Bethnal Green. She was a young woman who had been romantically involved with Reggie for a number of years. He had met her through Frances's brother Frank, who worked as an occasional driver for the Krays. In one photo, the 21-year-old can be seen in a white wedding dress being kissed by Ronnie and Reggie on each cheek. Ronnie was the best man, and the wedding was a lavish affair with celebrities attending along with celebrated famous photographer David Bailey taking photos. The ceremony was a huge celebration, and after a honeymoon in Athens, Reggie had a chance to settle down and enjoy the money he had made. The same couldn't be said for Ronnie, as he became obsessed with the idea of becoming the kingpin of London's underworld. In an attempt to emulate a godfather figure, Ronnie would buy immaculate suits and flamboyant jewelry and was well aware of the benefits of having friends in high places, but didn't quite realize the trouble that would bring. During July the previous year, an article appeared in the pages of the Sunday Mirror which suggested that an unnamed lord was having a homosexual affair with the London gangster. Being gay was a criminal offence at the time and was punishable by a prison term. The following week, the Sunday Mirror suggested they had proof of the affair which was too explicit to print. The photo was of Ronnie Kray, sat with Lord Boothby, the Conservative politician. Another headline read, "The picture we must not print." The Krays had threatened the journalist that had played a part in the article, and the threat of legal action was announced not only by Lord Boothby, but also bizarrely a solicitor for the Labour Party. Labour MP Tom Dryburgh had also been wrapped up in the scandal, and the party were keen to protect his reputation before a looming general election. Ronnie Kray lived in Cedar Court, just under 5 miles north of Valence Road, and his neighbour Leslie Holt introduced him to Lord Boothby. Although there have been rumours surrounding both Lord Boothby's and Tom Dryburgh's sexual orientation, it was an open secret amongst their peers in Westminster which had been kept out of the tabloids. Neither political party wanted the public to hear the news that one of their members was involved in a homosexual scandal, not least with a gangster, so the police were quietly asked to take no action and the information was buried. At the start of August 1964, in a letter sent to the Times newspaper, Lord Boothby denied all of the allegations against him, calling the claims a tissue of atrocious lies, and suggested the person he'd met for a new business opportunity was a gentleman. Lord Boothby explained that he had turned the man's business proposal down. But Ronnie Kray's name was not mentioned. Lord Boothby would later receive £40,000 in compensation, and a printed apology in the Daily Mirror. The editor was fired and used as a scapegoat by the man in charge of the Mirror Group, Cecil King. Up until his death, Ronnie was candid about his sexuality and vehemently denied that anything happened between him and Lord Boothby, and this is likely to be true. The pair were often seen together in public, and there had been more than a few accounts which suggested they at least attended the late-night parties. Throughout the twins' rise to notoriety, Ronnie had kept his homosexuality a secret. It wouldn't be until Reggie and Ronnie made a name for themselves in the West End that Ronnie openly spoke about it. He was no longer afraid to take men out for dinner or breaks in the country. Few people would have the nerve to voice a negative opinion about Ronnie's sexuality to his face, but George Cornell did, and would ultimately regret it. Ronald Kray, prisoner number 058110. Reginald Kray, prisoner number 058111, report to the Life Sentencing Review Committee. The Kray twins have been located in C Wing, Parkhurst since January 1975, and are both clearly content to remain there for the foreseeable future. Apart from the fact they had both settled and had carved a niche for themselves in the role of godfather, their positions in the inmate hierarchy were less threatened than they would have been with the younger emerging gangsters on normal location. Although they have in the past voiced the view that they expect to serve 12 years, they demonstrate some degree of recognition of the reality of their situation by recently updating their estimate to 15 years. Interestingly, it has often been noted that when one brother is to the fore, the other adopts the less dominant role and vice versa. Clearly, both men wield a considerable degree of influence within the wing and continue to be perceived as extremely dangerous, especially Ronald Kray because of the psychotic nature of his mental state. In some respects I feel Reginald Kray's opportunity to make progress is restricted because of his loyalty to his brother. I cannot conceive them ever agreeing to go their separate ways. Senior Probation Officer, name redacted, June 8, 1977. Ronald Kray, prisoner number 058110, extract from a report on prison conduct. Ronald Kray remains an active and predatory homosexual, who cares little who knows it. He undoubtedly shelters beneath the umbrella thrown over him by his twin brother and makes occasional forays from this protection to reassert his status in the minds of lesser men. One would guess that this behavior pattern has existed for the twins since they were children. The impact of the Kray twins in the prison community remains considerable. They certainly influence life in C Wing to a large degree and maintain contacts in other parts of the prison to a greater extent than they should theoretically be able to. Undoubtedly this is more due to their history and the clan loyalties of the East End criminal subculture than to their present activities. The twins entertain hopes of an eventual transfer to Kingston, but agree that Parkhurst and specifically C Wing is the best place for them now. They're happy enough, and cause little bother, and I agree with them that they're best left where they are for the next few years. Author redacted. July 20, 1977. After Reggie Kray's wedding in 1965, Ronnie's mental health continued to decline and he suffered from both bouts of crippling depression and pathological rages. Ronnie would take medication, but over time the effects wore off. He kept an armory fully stocked which included 2 Browning machine guns and even attempted to purchase some limpet mines and hand grenades. He was paranoid and convinced everyone was out to get him. It wasn't until the Richardson brothers appeared on the scene that Ronnie became laser-focused on causing as much carnage as possible. The Richardson brothers, who were based south of the River Thames, were worlds apart from the Krays and their East End beginnings. Raised in a middle-class family, Eddie and Charlie Richardson were highly intelligent, but it wasn't their business interest that gained them notoriety. They ran a scrapyard in Brixton, nothing out of the ordinary, but the brutal violence they inflicted on their rivals set them apart. Along with the beatings which were common, they would utilize pliers and electricity to get what they wanted, either pulling out a victim's teeth and nails or electrocuting them. On some occasions, they also employed a nail gun to pin their victims' appendages to the floor or wall. In an event that would drive Ronnie to murder, the Richardsons and the Krays met to discuss how both gangs could continue their business without it descending into a bloodbath. Although the talks broke down rather quickly at the Astor Club in Mayfair, the meeting was ending amicably before George Cornell, a member of the Richardson crew, promptly said to Ronnie, "Take no notice of Kray, he's just a big fat puff." It seemed like retribution was on the cards and Ronnie wanted blood. Furious at the slur, Ronnie's reckoning couldn't be unfurled on the entire Richardson gang, and they ended up in a shootout on March 8, 1966 with another gang at Mr. Smith's, a pub in Catford. This resulted in the group almost decimating themselves, and an affiliate of the Krays, Richard Hart, was shot and killed in the process. Mad Frankie Fraser, a member of the Richardson gang, would eventually be charged with the murder of Richard Hart. However, he was later found not guilty. The police were again met with a wall of silence. However, rumors circulated that it was George Cornell who pulled the trigger. George had managed to escape being caught by the police, but instead of going into hiding, he travelled north to visit a friend in hospital far from the safety of South London and only a mile from the Krays' home. What was left of the Richardson gang were rounded up and arrested, and with Eddie Richardson seriously wounded, it would be George Cornell who would feel the brunt of Ronnie's rage after he was eventually shot in cold blood. George Cornell had grown up with the twins in the East End, and had spent time behind bars for a number of violent assaults. He dabbled in blackmail and pornography before falling in love and marrying a woman from South London. Shortly after moving there, he became a Richardson go-to man when they wanted to torture someone for information. There was no love lost with the Krays, as they believed George had deserted them. The Blind Beggar pub, the large Victorian building on Mile End Road, was almost empty when the 38-year-old George Cornell sat at the corner of the bar. Ronnie was informed of his location, so travelled there with his driver John Dixon and his Scottish minder Ian Barry, ready to prove they were prepared to do whatever it took to the Richardson gang or any opposition. Ronnie and Ian Barry walked into the pub in Whitechapel on March 9, 1966. They entered at about 8:30 p.m, while The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore by the Walker Brothers was playing on the jukebox. George turned around and reportedly said, "Well, look who's here." Ronnie pointed his 9mm Mauser pistol at George Cornell's head and pulled the trigger. Ian Barry was in shock. He produced a gun and fired 2 shots into the ceiling so witnesses would keep their heads down and not be able to get a good look at them. George Cornell held on to life, but died at 3 o'clock the next morning, in the Royal London Hospital, on Whitechapel Road. Even though police arrived shortly after the shooting, not one of the witnesses implicated Ronnie or Ian. The gang drove to a pub in Stoke Newington called the Coach and Horses, where Ronnie scrubbed the gunpowder burns from his hands, and burned his clothes. He would later say of the incident, "I felt fucking marvelous. I've never felt so good, so bloody alive before or since." Reggie was again the one who had to clean up the mess his brother had created. George Cornell's widow knew that Ronnie was involved and showed up at their mother's flat one night shouting and screaming. She was beside herself and wasn't afraid of the twins. Aware of the attention George's murder had stirred up, Ronnie and Reggie went to Morocco and returned 3 weeks later after things had died down. Arriving back in London to find their protection money was no longer being collected, the brothers needed to do something to raise the morale of their gang, so decided to break out an acquaintance from prison. Some say this was to highlight the prisoner's plight, others believe this was a show of strength on behalf of the Krays to prove they could get anyone out of prison. However, no one truly knows their motives apart from Reggie and Ronnie. Frank Mitchell, otherwise known as the Mad Axeman, was a prisoner in Dartmoor and had served time with Ronnie in Wandsworth. He was an imposing figure of 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighing 17 stone. He had been placed in Brampton and Broadmoor psychiatric hospitals and had escaped both. While on the run, he had broken into nearby homes and attacked the occupants with an iron bar and a meat cleaver. He was eventually captured and sentenced without an expected release date. He was sent to Dartmoor prison, and surprisingly became docile, with his behavior improving dramatically. He bred budgies in his cell, and due to his good behavior, he was transferred to the honor party, a group of prisoners allowed to work outside on the moors. He would pop down to the local pub and even the pet shop to purchase more budgies. Possibly due to his size, nobody thought to challenge him. He had more freedom in Dartmoor than any other prison, but as the Home Office never provided a release date, he looked to be behind bars indefinitely. When the Krays discovered this, they planned to break him out of jail temporarily so he could write to the Home Secretary to plead his case. If a release date was granted, he would return to prison. On December 12th, Frank Mitchell left his cell to work outside repairing some fence posts with 4 other prisoners. At around 3:30 p.m. he asked a guard if he could walk across the field to feed some wild ponies. A car was waiting for him. He was driven from the prison to a flat on Barking Road owned by an associate of the Krays called Lenny Dunn. Frank spent the following 2 weeks getting Teddy Smith to write letters for him to the press and Home Secretary, explaining the injustice that he believed had befallen him and asking for leniency. While there, the Krays arranged for nightclub hostess Lisa Prescott to keep him company. In awe of the woman, Frank declared he was madly in love and they were going to get married. While he was free from prison, he suddenly realized that he had even less freedom in his new flat. When the Home Secretary announced there could be nothing more done until Frank handed himself in, Frank began to get agitated. News was getting out that the Krays had broken him out of prison, and with Frank believing that by going back he could get a release date and marry this new woman in his life, this became a concern for the twins. If Frank returned, he could implicate them in his escape. The Mad Axeman began to threaten the twins, so Reggie and Ronnie explained that they would be willing to take him somewhere secret into the countryside if he calmed down. Frank agreed, and on Christmas Eve in 1966, the van arrived to pick him up, but he was never seen or heard from again. To this day, Reggie and Ronnie state that Frank is still out of the country but have never said where. Despite their attempts to boost the morale of fellow gang members through the release of Frank Mitchell, rumors began to circulate that Frank may have met his end at the hands of the Krays or one of their accomplices. A few years later, Albert Donahue would eventually speak up in court during the trial in 1969, alleging that Frank Mitchell was in fact shot by an old friend of Ronnie and Reggie's, Freddie Foreman. The twins had made no progress with lifting the firm's spirits. However, the police were also making no headway into the deaths of Frank Mitchell and George Cornell. As things seemed to be getting back on track financially for the twins, Reggie's entire universe came crashing down before him. After a few months of marriage, his wife had been struggling with the new restrictions placed upon her. She was given a car but couldn't drive. She was made to stay at home, always being watched by a member of the firm, and though she'd had a job before the marriage, she wasn't allowed to go back to work. Unable to cope, she returned to her parents and received treatment for depression. In June 1967, after swallowing a cocktail of drugs, Frances Kray was dead. She was only 23 years old. Although Ronnie had his problems, his mental health issues looked to be somewhat under control. The tables had turned and now Reggie was on the edge. Devastated by the loss of his wife, Reggie's grief turned to anger and he went off in the deep end. He began to drink heavily. He shot 2 men in the legs and attacked another with a knife before slashing their face. Cracks between the 2 brothers began to show. Ronnie would gloat that he was the harder of the 2 because he had killed George Cornell, and he would taunt Reggie that he was going soft. Reggie took the bait. Jack McVitie was also known as Jack the Hat, due to the array of headwear which he always wore to hide his boldness. Jack struggled with drink and drugs. It was likely this that played a part in him stealing money from the twins. To win back their favor, He was asked to end the life of Leslie Payne, who Ronnie believed had become a police informant. Jack McVitie was provided with an advance and a gun, but failed to go through with the hit as Leslie Payne wasn't in when Jack paid him a visit. He never killed Leslie Payne or gave the Krays their money back. He was becoming a liability. Ronnie was accusing Reggie of being weak for not taking punitive measures, and shortly after, Jack wandered into the Regency in Hackney with a sawn-off shotgun looking for the twins and threatening the locals. Now something had to be done. Ronnie claimed that he was going to end the life of Jack the Hat, but Reggie was sure that he was going to get there first. On October 29, 1967, Reggie spent the evening drinking heavily, under the belief that Jack would appear at the Regency later that night. Armed with a revolver, Reggie arrived, however Jack was nowhere to be found. Infuriated, Reggie left the Regency, deciding to entrust the weapon with Anthony Barry, one of the two brothers who ran the club. Reggie arrived at a party nearby where Ronnie was disappointed to learn that his brother had been unable to go through with the murder. So, frustrated, he asked Ronnie Hart, the twins' cousin, to head to the Regency to request Anthony Barry bring him the gun. While Ronnie Hart was off on his duties, Ronnie Kray asked Christopher and Tony Lambriano to find Jack McVitie and bring him to a basement flat on Evering Road in Stoke Newington. It wouldn't be long before they returned with Jack in tow, who was expecting to turn up to a party. He was heavily intoxicated and demanded more booze before asking, "Where are all the birds?" An argument erupted, and Jack McVitie began fighting with the twins. Ronnie said, "Come on, Jack, stand up like a man." Jack replied, "Yes, but I don't want to die like one," before pleading, "Let's talk then." Reggie and Ronnie let Jack go. Jack tried to flee up the stairs. He was grabbed by Ronnie, who pulled him back into the room and threw him on the sofa. The two began arguing, but Jack was unaware that Reggie was standing behind him. Jack McVitie's life should have ended that moment when Reggie Kray pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't go off. Now realizing that his life was in danger, Jack tried to jump out of a window. His head and shoulders made it, but not the rest of him. His attempt would have worked but for the twins grabbing him by the legs and pulling him back in. Ronnie held both Jack's arms behind his back. Jack kept saying, "Leave off, Reg, leave off." As Ronnie said, "Go on, Reg, kill him, Reg." Ronnie Bender attempted to fix the gun that hadn't fired, but as it still wouldn't work, he passed Reggie a large carving knife which he had been carrying. Reggie stabbed Jack in the face and stomach before thrusting the blade through his neck numerous times after the victim fell to the ground. His body was wrapped in a bedspread and taken to a waiting car. The knife and the gun were thrown into a canal on Queensbridge Road. Only the Krays and members of the firm had witnessed the murder, and it was unlikely that anyone would be mentioning the incident to the police other than Jack's widow, who reported him missing. The Lambriano brothers and Ronald Bender disposed of the body. Tony Lambriano drove the car with the corpse only for it to run out of petrol on the way. Unsure of what to do, they dumped the body near a churchyard. The twins eventually heard what they had done and dispatched Freddie Foreman to retrieve the body and dispose of it. After Jack McVitie was stabbed to death in October 1967, it was no surprise that people weren't talking. Rumors surrounded the eventual fate of his body. Some say he was eaten by pigs, others say he was burnt in a furnace, people said he was buried in concrete, or thrown out to sea. Scotland Yard were aware of the Krays, their influence, and their criminal activities. Only a month before Jack McVitie met his end, a new task force led by Leonard Nipper Reid was set up to bring the Krays to justice. Detective Superintendent Reid earned his nickname due to his small stature, and in history as a police boxing champion. Around 5'7" tall, he may not have been an imposing figure, but the 42-year-old had made a name for himself playing a role into the investigation of the Great Train Robbery, which had taken place during August of 1963. Along with his team of just over a dozen detectives, they moved to a separate office under the pretense they were investigating a murder in Northern Ireland. To ensure that there wouldn't be leaks in the investigation, only the most senior staff of Scotland Yard were aware of why they were there. The Krays had so many officers on their side it was nearly impossible to know who to trust. Leonard Reed had been part of the initial investigation into the Krays, but after Ronnie's name came up as the gangster said to be involved with Lord Boothby in 1964, the investigation into the twins was put on hold, and none of the evidence gathered could be used. Detective Superintendent Reed set out to find everything he could about Reggie and Ronnie, and even made attempts to interview their associates and previous victims, despite the Krays making it quite clear what they would do to anyone who spoke out against them. It wouldn't be an underling or someone who orbited the firm that would spill their innermost secrets, but someone who is extraordinarily close to the Krays. Leslie Payne, the Krays business manager, had spent nearly a month with Leonard Reed providing information on the brothers and their business connections. Leslie Payne was loyal to the Krays, however, after they mistakenly believed that he was a police informant, they asked Jack McVitie to end his life. Jack's attempt failed, and fearing for his safety, this spurred Leslie Payne to go to the police in December 1967. In a 200-page report written in a hotel room in London, the police had everything they needed, but now they had to prove it. Leonard Reed also spoke to Lenny Hamilton, who had been attacked, branded and struck with a meat tenderizer by Ronnie. He was only too happy to tell detectives everything that had happened. One by one, former members of the Kray gang spoke up, and told the detective superintendent about the murders. Even with the precautions the task force undertook, it wasn't long until the Krays were made aware of their investigation, but under the belief that they were untouchable, the brothers gave it little thought. They considered the task force to be nothing more than a joke, and Ronnie and Reggie even purchased 2 python snakes, which they named Gerard and Nipper, after the detectives who had worked on the Hideaway Court case. In an odd sense of foreboding, the 2 snakes proved impossible to handle, with one being returned to the previous owner, and the other escaping. Detective Superintendent Reed had to walk a fine line between discreetly investigating the Krays but ensuring his investigation couldn't be perceived as harassment. After the trial involving the Hideaway Club, Reggie and Ronnie could claim they were being victimized, and with the work Leonard Reed's team had carried out, it could be undone. With Leslie Payne out of the picture, an American, Alan Cooper, played more of an active role in the lives of the Krays. He helped them with the Canadian bonds they'd sold. Through Alan Cooper, the Krays again met with the American Mafia in New York during April 1968. The discussions went well, and Alan Cooper suggested that the Krays should consider helping the Mafia assassinate a Maltese club owner that they wanted dead. In a show of strength, they decided they would blow up his car, with him inside it. Alan Cooper dispatched an associate, Paul Elvey, to fly to Glasgow to obtain the explosives. The man in question purchased the dynamite. Elvey, as he boarded the plane home, was arrested and called in for questioning. Leonard Reed soon discovered that Paul Elvey was working for Alan Cooper, so he was also brought in to be questioned. In a strange twist, Alan Cooper was someone that Leonard Reed's supervisors were aware of. He was apparently working for the United States Treasury Department, and was attempting to get Reggie and Ronnie arrested on charges of attempted murder. Unable to use the courier, detectives instead decided that Alan Cooper should then operate as an informant, and the twins would implicate themselves from a recording device that he would have on his person. The Krays had no reason to doubt him, as he had helped them to obtain visas, so they could travel to America. Informing the brothers that he was now confined to a hospital bed, he invited them for a chat, but as the twins had a gut feeling that something just didn't feel quite right, they sent a go-between. Aware that Scotland Yard was watching their every move, the Krays took a step back from their business. Authorities had made little progress on the disappearances of Jack McVitie and George Cornell, and with the Richardsons and their gang out of the picture as they were either in jail or dead, the twins felt that they just needed to sit tight. A month later in May, believing the heat was off, and wanting to have a night on the town, Ronnie and Reggie, and the rest of the firm, headed to the Astor Club in Mayfair. There they spent the evening drinking, and left early the next morning on May 9, 1968. At 6 o'clock in the morning, just before they managed to drift off to sleep, the front door of the flat was broken off its hinges and a crowd of police burst into their parents' home in Braithwaite House in Finsbury. The twins were placed in handcuffs, and read their rights. Reggie and Ronnie weren't the only ones being arrested that morning. At the same time, across London's East End, over 100 armed police officers raided over 20 addresses, and made numerous arrests with charges including conspiracy to murder, fraud and assault. There was no evidence linking the brothers to the murders at the time, but with the Krays in police custody, maybe others would talk, as this proved they were not untouchable. While waiting trial, Reggie and Ronnie were held in Brixton Prison. Friends and family members dropped by, including their mother, who brought them sandwiches and the odd bottle of wine. They planned to get other members of the firm to admit to the murders. Albert Donahue would confess to the murder of Frank Mitchell, Jack Dixon would take the blame for the death of George Cornell, and Ronnie Hart would admit to killing Jack McVitie. Albert Donahue didn't take too kindly to being asked to take the blame for a murder he didn't commit. In an attempt to highlight some of the perceived liberties they believed the authorities were taking, Reggie and Ronnie requested that all press restrictions on the trial be lifted. Initially, it looked like no one was going to talk. However, after hearing at Old Street Magistrates Court, in July 1968, the brothers' fears were being realized. In the preliminary hearing, they discovered that Lenny Dunn, whose flat had been used to hide Frank Mitchell, had given himself up. Billy Exley, who helped Frank Mitchell escape from Dartmoor and stood guard during the murder of George Cornell, testified against the twins, along with the barmaid of the Blind Beggar, who had previously received threats to keep her mouth shut. But as the twins were now behind bars, she explained that Ronnie and his minder Ian Barry had been involved. After the hearing, it was decided that the twins would remain in custody for the rest of the year before the trial. Albert Donahue, who was being charged with murder, asked to speak to Detective Superintendent Reed. He said, "I can tell you all about who did Mitchell, Cornell, McVitie, the lot." In the past, Albert Donahue had been on the receiving end of Ronnie Kray's temper. After being shot in the foot, he was sure that the Krays would have him silenced, so he told the investigating officers everything. For the witnesses to step forward, including Carol Skinner, who was in the flat where Jack McVitie had been murdered, she'd been too terrified to testify at the time, but with the Krays in prison, she felt able to speak up. Police managed to locate the gun that had failed to go off before Jack McVitie was murdered, and Ronnie Hart, a member of the firm, and distant cousin to the Krays, who had witnessed Jack McVitie's murder, was arrested, and then gave full statements about the events of that night. It was decided the case relating to the murder of Frank Mitchell would be tried separately later in the year. The trial was held at the Old Bailey on January 7, 1969, and Justice Melford Stevenson presided over the case. 10 men, either members of the firm or direct associates, were charged in connection with the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie. Ronnie Kray and Ian Barry were charged with the murder of George Cornell. Reggie and Ronnie Kray, Christopher, and Tony Lambriano, and Ronald Bender, were charged with the murder of Jack McVitie. Reggie also faced charges of being an accessory to the murder of George Cornell, His brother Charlie, along with Freddie Foreman, Cornelius Whitehead and Anthony Barry, were charged with being an accessory to the death of Jack McVitie. Cornelius Whitehead had worked as a driver for Ronnie, and although he took no part in the murder, he was present at Evering Road along with a friend of the Krays, Anthony Barry, who was also there when Jack McVitie died. The trial was big news in the tabloids, and celebrities either attended the proceedings, or sent the twins good luck telegrams. Seats in the public gallery were being auctioned off for £5 on the black market, with many seeing it as the trial of the century. Although the Krays and their associates remained steadfast, denying each of the charges against them, it was becoming clear that the prosecution had a strong case. Ronnie Hart and John Dixon gave evidence on behalf of the prosecution in return for escaping any prison time. Lenny Hamilton also testified after he was sent a letter in prison by the Krays. It threatened to kill his children if he spoke up. The barmaid from The Blind Beggar gave evidence and pointed out the man she saw kill George Cornell. Tensions were high, and in one instance, Reggie shouted, "The police are scum," when they relayed details of Francis's death. When it was revealed that the police held his grandparents' pension books, Ronnie called one of the prosecutors a fat slob. After all the evidence had been presented, the jury retired to consider its verdict. At that time, it was the longest murder trial in English legal history. But on March 4, 1969, after 6 hours and 54 minutes, the jury reached the decision. Guilty. Overall, 28 witnesses gave evidence against the Krays and members of the firm. On March 8, 1969, the judge, Mr. Justice Stevenson, addressed the twins and said, "I'm not going to waste my words on you. In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities. I sentence you to life imprisonment, which I recommend should be no less than 30 years. Ian Barry was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Christopher and Anthony Lambriano each received 15 years. Charlie Kray and Freddie Foreman were both sentenced to 10 years for disposing of Jack McVitie's corpse, along with Cornelius Whitehead, who received 7 years. Anthony Barry was the only defendant to be found not guilty. On April 15, 1969, a second trial took place for the murder of Frank Mitchell. Although it was a compelling case, no one could say for sure who actually murdered Frank, so the Kray brothers and their associates were found not guilty. The only charge that did stick was that of harboring a criminal, of which Reggie was found guilty. A further 5 years were added to his sentence, which would run concurrently. The judge ordered that any charges relating to their further criminal conduct lie on file. In his book, Respect, and in a television documentary in 2000, Freddie Foreman would later admit he was the one who shot Frank Mitchell. Despite his admission, and after being interviewed by police, no further action was taken. So where are we now? There are still rumors that surround the death of Frances Shay. Was she murdered? There are many theories about what happened, but one is yet to be proven aside from the unsubstantiated claims and gossip that fill the corners of internet chat rooms. Leonard Nipper Reid served as National Coordinator of Regional Crime Squads and as Assistant Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire before his retirement. He received a Queen's Police Medal for gallant and distinguished service. Here he is, talking about the arrest.
This was at 6 o'clock in the morning. All the raids had been timed, synchronized to be at the same time. And we knew that the Krays the night before had been to a West End club. They were taken out of their beds. They caused us no concern or trouble at all.
How much danger were you in during the inquiry?
Well, it's difficult to gauge, really. There was suggestions from various sources that there was some personal danger. I took what I considered to be reasonable precautions. I used to go home frequently on a different route, and also I go running in the mornings, about 5 miles every morning. When I was interviewed by the press, I denied this emphatically because I considered that at that time in the morning, alone in a vest and running shorts, I would be very vulnerable, unless I could run faster than them, of course.
It's been said a police officer develops some sort of relationship with the criminals that he's hunting. What relationship did you have with the twins?
Well, there was no real relationship between the Krays and myself. I'd known them for some time, but I never felt any animosity towards them. This was a facade that was built up, I think, by the Krays. They projected this to the public generally, that this was some sort of hate campaign between themselves and the police, and particularly myself, but this is not the case at all. I know that they disliked me intensely. I know that they, at one stage, bought a snake, which they called Nipper Reed, and there was great jubilation when this snake died. Ronald Kray, I understand, used to feed it live mice.
One assumes you had to use fairly unorthodox methods on occasions.
Well, of course. All detectives use disguises, as you know. In this case, probably more than most. We used a variety of disguises, and they were quite successful. For instance, I, from time to time, posed as a parson, as a dustman, and as a road sweeper, and this kind of thing. One of my officers, I think, even posed as a BBC television interviewer.
What about the use of so-called double agents?
We did employ this from time to time, and very successfully. Of course, a double agent can never be fully trusted, and bearing that in mind, they were used mainly to influence the Krays that we were taking certain action, whereas in fact we were not. In other words, to feed them completely false and bogus information.
How does this case differ to all the others that you've had a hand in?
It was completely independent from New Scotland Yard. We broke away entirely from the normal routine. I had to answer only to the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Mr. John de Rose, and in that light it was quite different from other inquiries. It was necessary for secrecy to be maintained. This was most important. And towards that end, Detective Superintendent Donald Adams handpicked most of the men that came onto the inquiry subsequently.
Originally, the officer who was deputed to undertake this investigation had to let it be known amongst his colleagues that he had been given a confidential inquiry concerning a domestic matter within the force. In those circumstances, nobody troubled to ask him any further questions. But as the team was augmented, it became obvious that some people might learn something of what was happening. With that in view, the whole of the team was transferred from New Scotland Yard to Tintagel House, where we operated quite successfully. Each and every one of these items was recovered during the course of the Kray inquiry. Some of them are quite obvious in their use. Perhaps the one thing which is unique, certainly unique in my experience, is this, what appears to be perfectly innocuous case. But down here we have a hypodermic syringe. This bottle here was to have contained cyanide. The idea of the operation was that this needle here would protrude, not as far as it is at the moment, but just a little way out of the box. And by manipulating this ring here, the plunger would be released, which would release the cyanide which is inside the hypodermic syringe out into the needle. Now the way in which it would have been used would have been to have swung the case so that the needle penetrated the victim. The cyanide would enter the victim's body and he would be dead within 8 seconds.
It's important to remember that the police can take no action against anyone unless there is evidence available. This, so far as the Krays was concerned, was always the difficulty. It was essential, of course, that if the police launched an operation against the Krays and their empire, it had to be successful. We could not afford an abortive inquiry. This would have damaged the police public image, and we just could not afford to do that. It's also important to remember that had this happened, had we had an abortive inquiry, the Krays had many influential friends in all sorts of walks of life, and I can visualize that a large complaint would have ensued.
After serving 7 years, Charlie Kray was released from prison in 1975. He protested his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with the disposal of Jack McVitie's body. In July 1997, he was arrested for conspiracy to smuggle cocaine. He died behind bars on April 4, 2000, and his brother Reggie gave a brief statement to the press after the ceremony.
He's the friendliest of people, and I'm sure that everyone gathered here today would like to see everyone more friendly towards each other, more so than ever, because he's a very friendly person.
After their sentence, Reggie Kray was sent to Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight and Ronnie was held at Durham. They remained apart for 3 years. Their mother campaigned continually to have them reunited, and in early April 1972, Ronnie was transferred to Parkhurst. This time it wasn't without incident, and after a number of violent outbursts, he was eventually transferred to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital in Berkshire. Without fail, come rain or shine, Violet Kray would visit her boys twice a week until her death in August 1982. The funeral was held in Chingford on August 11th, and both Reggie and Ronnie were permitted to attend. It was the first time the twins had been seen in public for nearly a decade, and a huge crowd of reporters gathered outside as the funeral turned into a media frenzy.
Violet Kray died the day before her 73rd birthday, still fighting to get parole for her notorious twins, the gangsters who were sentenced to 30 years each in 1969 for murder. Violet was a popular East End figure, as shown by the carloads of reeds and mourners that arrived at her council flat this morning. Her husband Charles led the family mourners with elder son Charlie close behind. The twins were at the church ahead of them. Ronnie was first, now classified as criminally insane, and serving out his sentence in Broadmoor, where he paints and writes poetry. Then came Reggie, also handcuffed from the maximum security wing at Parkhurst, where a few months ago he tried to kill himself. At the end of the short service, the twins were taken back to their cells without having seen their mother buried. Reggie was the first to leave. He's not due to be released until 1999. And so Violet Kray was buried as her beloved twins would have wished, but not seen, with hundreds of grieving friends and relations paying their last respects. And another chapter in this extraordinary family history was closed.
Reggie and Ronnie's father died the following year, although the twins didn't attend his funeral, fearing what the publicity might do. Although Ronnie remained in Broadmoor, he still managed to operate some of the Krays business enterprises with his brothers after some business cards were found amongst his things. Even with Ronnie in a psychiatric hospital, and Reggie in jail, it was believed they were operating a bodyguard protection service called Kray Enterprises, with their brother Charlie, who had since been released from prison. Ronnie Kray married twice while he was hospitalized. The first was to a woman called Elaine Mildner. The couple had developed a relationship after they began writing letters to one another. They split up after only 4 years together in 1989. Ronnie's second marriage was to a woman called Kate Howard, in a ceremony at Broadmoor Hospital during November of that same year, but the couple divorced in 1994. Ronnie Kray died a year later, on March 17, 1995, after suffering a heart attack. He was 61 years old. A funeral was held and Reggie was granted leave to attend. An enormous crowd gathered outside to greet him. After the ceremony, the press briefly spoke to him about his brother.
Well, he's a good brother, he's very loyal, and he's very generous. There are lots of nice ways about him, and I should always remember him with good memories, you know. And I know he's at peace. That's the main thing. He's at peace. So his friends at peace. So please.
Led on by Frankie Fraser, the crowds cheered for Reggie as he left to go back to prison.
Cheers for Reg!
Reggie's brother Charlie spoke to a reporter after the ceremony.
The one thing I would love people to remember, who say bad things, remember he had an illness. And if it wasn't for that, he'd have been a different person.
The press also spoke about Ronnie Kray to author, journalist and convicted armed robber John McVicker.
They weren't liked at the time. They were certainly respected and feared, but they weren't liked. There won't be too many tears shed about the demise of Ronnie Kray. I would say great funeral, shame about the life.
John McVicker also spoke about Ronnie's mental state.
He would see messages from television. He would talk that people were out to kill him. He would see threat everywhere. And this is what made him so ferocious and so dangerous, because from a quite innocuous sort of remark or glance, suddenly Ronnie Kray would turn on someone. Believe me, he's reckoned to slice up more people than most people have cut up Sunday joints.
Reggie Kray. A Category A prisoner was moved between a number of prisons up and down the country. These included Parkhurst, Leicester, Long Larton, Wandsworth, Gartrey, Lewes, Nottingham, Bloodeston, Maidstone, and Wayland. He spent some of his time painting, and donated the pictures to charity. While inside he also found God, and became a born-again Christian. He married Roberta Jones in July 1997. Reggie Kray was refused parole during 1998 as the parole board explained he had failed to complete relevant offending behavior work, and there were concerns that he was manipulative and devious. The board had also explained that he had been drinking alcohol in his cell, and had resisted his change to a Category C prisoner. His solicitor said the board's claims were factually incorrect. He said, "In reality, Mr. Kray is unable to resist any prison transfer as that is a matter solely within the remit of the prison service." He has no disciplinary findings recorded against him, and in respect of alcohol, he has indicated a willingness to complete any course or any work required of him, and he was assessed by 2 psychiatrists and 2 psychologists specifically for the purpose of this parole review. The concerns that Mr. Kray was manipulative and devious were made without any basis or evidence. After being diagnosed with inoperable cancer, Reggie Kray was released from prison on compassionate grounds during August 2000, and spent the final weeks of his life with his wife Roberta.
Office is releasing Reggie Kray on compassionate grounds. His former associates have long campaigned for his freedom. The prison staff are gone from Reggie Kray's bedside at this hospital in Norwich, but for now he will not be returning to his roots in the East End of London to spend his final days. Reggie Kray was last seen in public at his brother Charlie's funeral in April, already marked by the cancer of the bladder, which is now inoperable and which prevents him from being moved.
Reginald Kray passed away in his sleep on September 1, 2000. He was 66 years old.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.